Hello everybody, this is Karama's Girl 018, and this is part 2 of reading The Stolen Throne, Chapter 2. Hopefully this time I'll be able to actually finish it. Or finish the chapter, anyway. Logan was gone most of the afternoon, hoping to put his worst fears to rest. First he backtracked along the path the three of them had taken the previous night, confirming that they indeed had not been followed. He returned to the southern hills and followed there of the trails he knew, hoping to run into one of the men his father had sent out, or anyone really. But travelers this far south were few, and he saw only a flurry of horse tracks heading toward Lothering. By the time dusk fell and a storm began releasing torrents of ice-cold rain, Logan was truly worried. It wasn't until he ventured down a hazardous path not far from the town that he finally spotted someone. The route was most often used by smugglers, allowing them to avoid the more patrolled roads to the north on their way towards the western mountains and the dwarves, there who cared little for human laws. There were many such paths in the hinterlands, and few who used them had any legitimate reason to be there. A lone horseman appeared, hood pulled up, and his steed stepping carefully in the slippery mud. By the quality of his cloak, Logan would have guessed him a messenger for one of the city guilds, only he didn't appear to be in any kind of hurry. Logan approached from well down the road in full view. It was a friendly gesture, though the rider was wary enough to keep a hand on his sword hilt as he paused and waited. Lightning flared in the gray sky and the rain intensified, but Logan's leathers were already as drenched as they could possibly get. When he got within 20 feet, the rider backed his horse away and half drew his blade. The message was clear: "You've come close enough." "Greetings," Logan called out. When the rider did not respond immediately, he reached over his back and removed his bow, slowly putting it down on the ground in front of him. This seemed to reassure the rider somewhat, though the horse whinnied nervously and pranced about on the spot. "What do you want?" he finally called back. "I'm looking for friends," Logan shouted. "Men dressed like me. One of them might have come down this way, I'm hoping." "I haven't seen anyone," the rider responded. "But Lothering is filled with so many people that are sleeping in the streets. It's insanity. Your friends are probably there, if anywhere." Logan sheltered his eyes from the rain with a hand, trying to make out the rider's face into the hood. He couldn't. "Lothering is filled with people? You haven't heard?" The rider seemed genuinely surprised. "With all the soldiers passing through, I would have thought half the kingdom had heard already." "No, nothing. The rebel queen is dead." The rider sighed sadly, adjusting his hood as the rain splattered down. "Bastards finally caught her in the forest last night. They say I tried to see the body before I left, but there were too many mourners." The rider shrugged. "They say the young prince might be dead too, if you'll pardon me saying so. Let's hope that isn't true." Logan's blood went cold. "The prince?" he repeated numbly. "With any luck, he's still out there somewhere. Considering all the soldiers I saw, he'd better be running for his life." As the rain continued to pour, the rider nodded politely and gave Logan a wide berth as he passed by. Logan remained where he was, his mind racing. Lightning flashed high overhead. "Oh boy, tension." Merrick picked listlessly at the soup they brought him, idly curious about the exact kind of animal that had provided the gamey meat swimming in the broth. Finally, Sister Ilis took the bowl away from him and returned to her sewing. She spent her time patching blankets and clothing, humming softly to herself all the while. He caught pieces of the Chant of Light if he wasn't mistaken, though the exact verses eluded him. Truthfully, he had other things on his mind, such as getting out of the hut. He could hear activity going on outside like they were packing the entire camp up. The sister denied it. Merrick had asked 3 times if the men Gareth was waiting for had returned before the burly guard outside the door promised he would tell the sister immediately should the situation change, and it had not. Merrick sat on the bed fidgeting. He toyed again with the idea of confessing everything, but where would that get him? What would Gareth do, suddenly saddled with the fugitive who was far more dangerous than he had imagined? Better to get out, get away from these poor people, and find his own way back to the rebel army. Yet the closed door and the single guard proved to be an incredibly effective deterrent to this plan. "An excellent start to your reign, King Merrick," he chided himself. "This is the kind of first-class problem-solving that would serve you well when you take charge of the rebellion." "You're very hard on yourself," Sister Ilis commented, glancing up from her sewing. She was wearing a set of wearing a set of delicate dwarven spectacles that reminded Merrick of his grandfather, King Brandel. Brandel the Defeated, as everyone else remembered him. Merrick himself remembered the man as being both very sad and very proud. His grandfather possessed a pair of golden spectacles that he would immediately hide whenever he was caught wearing them, lest someone think he was going blind. As a child, Merrick used to think that it was a fun game to steal them and then race around the castle halls wearing them. At least it was fun until he was finally caught, usually by his mother. Mind you, even she had to stifle her giggles at the sight of Merrick in those things, and reprimanded him mostly for his grandfather's benefit. Afterwards, in private, she would laugh and kiss his nose, pleading with him half-heartedly not to do it again. Please, he ignored, of course. It was odd to remember that now. He hadn't thought of his grandfather in many years. He looked away from the sister and remembered she was waiting for a response. "I'm sorry, what?" "I said you're very hard on yourself. You're frightened. Anyone can see that." Her smile was knowing. "Have you considered that perhaps the reason you're here, young man, is because that the Maker led you here?" Merrick wanted it to be true. He stared at the floor until the sister returned to her sewing and left him be. Merrick didn't want these people to be hurt on his account, and more it looked like his best option was simply to dash out the door the next time it opened. If they killed him before he got out of the camp, then so be it. At least he would no longer be putting them in danger. He kept a stare on the floor for some time, listening to the beat of the rain against the hut and the frantic activity of the people outside. Men were yelling, things were being covered, children were giggling and being hustled into tents. The smell of fresh rain filled the hut, a scent that Merrick had reveled in when he was young because it meant Mother might be forced indoors. But now it only made him anxious. He felt like he was waiting for Logain to finally come and kill him. Gareth to command his release, another round of questioning, waiting for anything to happen. Or for something to happen. In time he slept, though only restlessly and without dreams. When the door to the hut finally slammed open, Merrick was unsure how much time had passed. The rain had barely slackened, the air now thick and damp from it, and at some point the elderly sister had also fallen asleep in her chair beside the bed. She started awake, gasping in surprise, and clutched at the heavy amulet around her neck. Gareth was at the door, soaked to the bone, but those icy blue eyes shone with intensity. "Maker's breath, Garrett," Sister Alice exclaimed. "What's wrong?" "Men, soldiers, coming through the forest." His mouth was pressed into a thin scowl, rivulets of water running down his armor and splattering on the floor. In 2 strides he was at Merrick and hauled him up off the bed by the scruff of his shirt. Gareth slammed him hard against the log wall, seeming ready to explode with rage. "What did you do?" Merrick should have felt frightened for his life, but he didn't. Somehow he was calm. It was a bizarre reaction, he knew, since Gareth seemed willing to kill him, and probably had every reason to. "I told you," Merrick said evenly. "They're coming for me. I think if you just give me to them, they might not even bother with you." "Why?" Gareth bellowed. The wind slammed the door loudly against the wall, and rain blew in with a cold howl. Already panicked shouts could be heard from throughout the camp. "Who are you?" Gareth shouted, slamming Merrick against the wall again, hard enough to knock the wind out of him. "Gareth, stop!" Sister Alice cried, clutching at his free arm. He shook her off without looking at her. "Tell me who you are." "I can tell you who he is," came a shout from the door. Logain was standing there, pale and soaking wet and with murder in his eyes. "Oh, things are picking up now." His knife was out, and with 2 steps he had it against Merrick's throat. "Maker damn him, he's the prince. He's the bloody prince." Gareth grabbed Logain's wrist with his free hand, and for a moment they fought over control of the knife. It seemed wavered dangerously at Merrick's throat and made a shallow cut into his skin. Once into his skin. Logain snarled with rage, and when he looked at his father, he seemed shocked at the aghast expression on his father's face. "What do you mean?" Gareth demanded, his tone steel cold. The battle for the knife paused. Logain did not relent, but he seemed disturbed by his father's sudden change. "They killed the rebel queen in the forest. The news is everywhere. That's the mother he told us about, Father. He just left at the most important part, didn't he?" Gareth's expression was unreadable as he digested this. He stared off into space, beads of water running down his forehead. Outside, the chaotic shouts continued. Bewildered, Sister Alice gathered her robes around her and rushed to close the door. The sound of the wind hissing around the door seemed to stir Gareth from his reverie. He turned his head slowly and stared at Merrick as if he had suddenly transformed into something terrifying. "Is this true?" I'm sorry." was all Merrick could say in return. There was a pause. Gareth violently shoved Logan away, the knight clattering down to the floor as Logan fell against the far wall of the room. Then, in one swift motion, Gareth dropped to one knee and bowed his head. "Your Highness." Gareth's voice trailed off into a quiet croak. Merrick looked around the room, completely at a loss at the sudden stillness. The way they stared at him, it was like they expected him to do something, but he had no idea what. Pull out a crown, perhaps? Burst into flames? That might be helpful, actually, he thought to himself. The storm pelted the hut with a renewed force, the only sound in the room. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. "You bow to him?" Logan finally asked in an incredulous voice, staring at his father. Then his tone became harsher, angrier. "You're protecting him? He lied to us!" "He's the prince," Gareth said, as if this was explanation enough. "He's not my prince. He's going to get us all killed." Logan jumped to his feet and strode over to Gareth with purpose. "Father, they aren't just coming through the forest. They're coming through the valley as well. We're surrounded, and all because they want him." "Look," Merrick tried his best to sound reasonable, "I don't want anyone to be hurt on my account. Just hand me over. I'll go willingly." "May God preserve us." Sister Alice stared at Merrick in dawning horror. Gareth stiffly stood up and walked over to the door, opening it. He stood there, looking out into the storm while they listened to the sounds of the people scrambling in the dark. His people. Off in the distance, terrified screaming could be heard, coupled with a deep-voiced shouting of strangers. "They're here already," the sister asked in a trembling voice. A tremulous voice? I don't know how you said it. Gareth merely nodded. "Then what are we to do?" Logan snatched up his blade from the ground. "We give him to them," he argued. "Father, he said it himself. We need to make a deal." "No." In a fury, Logan leaped forward and grabbed his father's shoulder, spinning him around. "Father!" The word was stated with unmistakable emphasis. It said, "Listen to me. We don't owe him anything." Gareth's expression became sad, and with a gentle gesture he reached up and removed Logan's hand from his shoulder. Logan did not resist, and the fury seemed to drain out of him as realization grew in his face. A witness to the moment that passed between father and son, Merrick didn't immediately understand it. "Can you get him away?" Gareth asked. Logan looked numb, but he nodded. "Wait!" Merrick protested feebly, raising a hand. "What?" Gareth sighed. "We need to get you to safety, Your Highness. Logan knows the forest. You can depend on him." With a swift motion, he drew his sword. "I will buy you time. I and everyone I can gather. You could come with us," Logan said to his father, his voice hopeless. "They would just give chase. No, that won't do." He glanced over at Sister Alice, who was watching with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Alice. I had hoped for something else." She shook her head emphatically. Her eyes glowed fiercely despite the tears. "You have no need to apologize to me, Gareth McTeer." Merrick's sense of calm was rapidly draining away. Could they actually be proposing what he was hearing? Listening to the distant screams, it was all becoming far far too quickly for his liking. "Stop!" he cried. "What are you talking about? This is madness!" Logan stared at him like it was Merrick who had gone mad, but Gareth stepped up to him and put a strong hand on his shoulder. "I served your grandfather once." Gareth's voice was firm and steady, and Merrick stared up at him with wide eyes. "The Orlesians don't belong on that throne, and if your mother is truly dead, then it is up to you now to remove them." He paused, setting his jaw, and when he continued, his voice cracked with emotion. "If I can help you do that, then I will give anything, even my life." "Father!" Logan's protest died on his lips as Gareth turned toward him. Merrick could tell that Gareth was resolute, and perhaps Logan saw the same. Still, Logan bristled with rebellion, furious at his father. Perhaps for giving so much to someone they barely knew, the very person who had put them in danger? Merrick could hardly fault him for that. "Logan, I want your word that you will protect the prince." "I can't just leave you here," Logan insisted. "They don't ask me to just leave you. I won't do it." "That's exactly what you will do. Your word, Logan." Logan looked stricken, and for a moment it seemed he teetered on the point of refusal. He shot a deadly look at Merrick, no doubt blaming him for all of it. But Gareth awaited his answer. Reluctantly, he nodded. Gareth turned back toward Merrick. "Then you need to go, Your Highness. Quickly." He was completely serious. Merrick didn't doubt that for a second, and he believed that Logan would keep his word despite how reluctant and torn he looked. Still, Merrick was stunned. If only he had known, he clearly could have trusted this man as soon as he arrived. He tried to think of something he could say in return, and 1,000 inadequate apologies came to mind, along with something his mother had once told him. What they will give us freely, she had said, is never free for them. Remembering that is the only way we will be worthy of it. Were you a knight, Gareth? He asked. The question seemed to take the man by surprise. No, Your Highness. I was a sergeant-at-arms once. Then kneel. It was Merrick's best imitation of his mother's tone, and it seemed to work. Face blank with shock, Gareth knelt. Sister Alice, I will need you to bear witness. She stepped forward. I will, Your Highness. Merrick put his hand on Gareth's head, hoping fervently that his memory was not so faulty as he feared. In the name of Calenhad the Great, here in the sight of the Maker, I declare you a knight of Ferelden. Rise and serve your land, Sir Gareth. The man stood stiffly, his eyes glinting beneath furrowed brows. Thank you, Your Highness. For what it's worth, Merrick apologized. There was nothing more to be said. Sorry, my eyes are kind of getting blurry. Logan stepped forward, interrupting the moment. His face was stony as he gestured to Merrick. We need to go. Now. Merrick nodded. Before he could move, the sister put up a hand and rushed over to the pile of clothes she had been mending in the corner. She pulled out a large woolen coat and without a word began helping Merrick to put it on. As they did so, Gareth turned quietly to his son. Logan. Don't. Logan cut him off, his voice harsh and bitter. He refused to meet his father's gaze. The two of them stood awkwardly as the shouting outside drew nearer to the hut. Finally, Gareth nodded. Do your best. Of course, came the curt response. Merrick was now wearing the coat and ready. The sister hesitated and reached into her robe, taking out a dagger so wicked-looking. Merrick's eyes widened with surprise. Before he could say anything, she placed the blade in his hands and closed his fingers over it. The sister's eyes looked into his, and they said, May the Maker forgive us all. He nodded his thanks, feeling chilled. Gareth readied his sword and stepped to the door, all business. Give me 1 minute, then run. Sister Alice stood beside him. I will go with you, she said quietly. Gareth looked as if he would have preferred to argue with her, but he decided against it. With a quick nod, both of them rushed out the door into the storm. Logan put an arm out, stopping Merrick from following them, not that he had been about to. Logan stared at the vacant door. His face was passive, but his eyes were intense, and Merrick decided it was best to say nothing. Instead, they waited in the dim light and listened. First they heard Gareth bellowing, his voice carrying over even the thunder and rain as he rallied the panicked outlaws to his side. There was more shouting, and Sister Alice cried out for someone to stop in the name of the Maker. The sound of battle erupted, coupled with cries of agony of the ring of steel on steel. Logan ran out the door, not saying a word, pulling Merrick with him. Merrick almost stumbled, but kept his footing while dashing into a sheet of freezing rain. Recognizing nothing in the rain and darkness disoriented him. Something large was burning nearby, and the sound of fighting surrounded him on all sides. He then fell to pull on his coat. Pay attention, Logan snapped. Merrick barely heard him over the commotion. Though the rain obscured much, he could make out the fight at the other end of the camp. He spotted Gareth, the big man swinging his sword in wide arcs and cutting a swath through soldiers that had undoubtedly expected nothing like this kind of resistance. But the soldiers were armored, and they outnumbered the handful of men Gareth had managed to rally. It was not going to be much of a battle. Others fled the camp in all directions, some gathering what little they could and others scrambling just to get away as they realized the extent of the assault. Several bodies lay on the ground in Merrick and Logan's path, one of them a young woman. Merrick almost tripped on her, causing Logan to hiss in fury again. They were running away from the main fight, but Merrick could hear other soldiers ahead of them in the darkness. Out of nowhere, a man appeared dressed in chainmail and wearing an undecipherable emblem on his blue tunic. His eyes widened in surprise, and he was about to shout for help, but Logan was too quick for him, and ran the man through without slowing down. Logan pushed the soldier off his sword with his boot, the man collapsing in a gurgling heap. Don't just stand there, Logan snapped, and Merrick realized that was exactly what he was doing. He started to run forward, but felt someone grab his arm from behind. Without thinking, he spun around and sank the dagger given to him by Sister Alice into the neck of a Blackbeard soldier. The man roared in surprise and pain, loosening his grip, and when Merrick yanked the blade out, a fountain of blood followed it. The soldier clutched uselessly at the wound, careening away before Merrick could stab at his foe a second time. He felt himself being dragged away. "Go! Now!" Logain roared. The pair of them sprinted, running past several tents and directly into a clump of trees at the edge of the camp. Logain led Merrick through thick bushes, the branches slapping wetly at their faces, and as they came out onto another part of the camp, they veered sharply. Avoiding an obscured scuffle not far away, they ran past two soldiers fighting to drag a screaming woman out of her tent. The soldiers did not even notice them as they passed, and when Merrick slowed out of concern for that woman, he felt himself yanked forward again. Reluctantly, he did as he was bidden. Two more soldiers sprang up in their path, but were dispatched by Logain with savage precision. The camp was little more than chaos and confusion. Merrick heard the blood-curdling cries behind him and the sounds of people fleeing in every direction. He heard a child wailing and men begging for help, soldiers shouting orders and giving chase. It was all that he could do to avoid keeping his foot on the mud and grass. Logain pulled him forward whenever he began to fall behind. It came as a shock when he realized that they had reached the edge of the camp. The hillside sloped down steeply into the forested valley below, and into the Kokari wilds, the southern wilderness uninhabited by all but the savages and the most dangerous of creatures. No sane man went there. "Why are we stopping?" Merrick asked, turning back to Logain. He shivered with cold, the merciless rain pounding down. Logain ignored him, and Merrick followed his gaze to where Gareth was fighting in the distance. It was far away, but the fire had spread enough that he could still be spotted even through the deluge. Heavily wounded and covered in blood, he had dozens of enemy soldiers surrounding him. His swings were becoming desperate. Merrick knew they should continue running and not waste any opportunity, but Logain remained still, transfixed by his father's battle. Then, though their vision was obscured by smoke and the rushing of soldiers, they made out a defiant shout that ended abruptly. Gareth's final cry. Merrick turned to Logain to say something, but wasn't sure what that might be. He said nothing. Logain's face was stone cold, his eyes glinting. Almost instantly, Logain sprang to action. He grabbed Merrick's coat once again, practically pulling him off his feet as they bolted down the hill. Logain's voice was low, icy and low. "Stay close, or I swear I'll leave you behind." Merrick stayed close. And that, everyone, is the end of Chapter 2. I will start reading on Chapter 3 for the next part of Raiding of the Stolen Throne. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Okay, that is done.